Keir Starmer has come under fire for barring Jeremy Corbyn from running as a Labour MP for Islington North. Party members have accused the Labour leader of running the party by diktat, not democracy, after the decision was taken without a fair or transparent process. This bypasses typical procedure, which hands this kind of decision to local party members. It also contradicts what Starmer himself said in 2020 when he tweeted, "The selections for Labour candidates need to be more democratic. We should end NEC impositions of candidates. Local party members should select their candidates for every election." Nice if it was true. Allies of Corbyn have told The Guardian that he will still apply as a Labour candidate and seek the backing of local members, despite the hostile moves from the party leadership. In response to these events, Labour's former Executive Director of Policy, Andrew Fisher, has published this piece today on NovaraMedia.com. And earlier today, I caught up with Andrew to tell us more about why he thinks Keir Starmer is a hypocrite.
I mean, chiefly at the moment, I think it's around what he said in 2020 that Labour Party members should select their own candidates, no imposition by the NEC. And yet he's just said, well, Jeremy Corbyn can't stand. And, it's not like Islington North members have had a say on that. And in fact, even the NEC hasn't had a say on that. So even kind of party rule book hasn't been respected there. And then there's the kind of secondary thing, if you like, which is about, he said, I'm going to tolerate no racism, no discrimination, no anti-Semitism within the party. And yet it's very clear that he's treating this exactly as a factional battle. And he has tolerated racism and indeed anti-Semitism, as long as it's from people in his faction and not from people on the left. So, for example, Diane Abbott was racially abused. The Ford report said she was abused using overtly racist tropes. The people who committed that abuse are still Labour Party members. They haven't been expelled so this zero tolerance seems to be very, very one-sided and factional. And actually that betrays what the Ford report found, which is, obviously the QC or rather KC now, appointed by Keir Starmer to investigate all of this. And he said there's a hierarchy of protected characteristics operating within the party. Keir Starmer yesterday said there's zero tolerance to all of it. We're not seeing that at all. So there's two levels on which he's hypocritical, at least.
Do you think that this will be a problem for him in a general election, or is this just a fight between the leader of the Labour Party and his members?
I think it will be a problem for him because he's acted, again, this is again using anti-Semitism as a factional weapon to try and tarnish the left using this entirely. And he said, anybody who wants to go back to 2019, can get out the door, basically. And yet he was a prominent member of the Labour Party in 2019. He was in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. He was asking people to make Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister. He stood on two, pretty left-wing manifestos himself. And, in 2020, stood on a policy platform that was pretty much summarised the key points of those manifestos, called Jeremy Corbyn a colleague and a friend. And yet now this is some awful backwater of racism and bigotry that has to be purged and left behind. And yet he wasn't saying it then. In fact, he was embracing it. So again, I think it will be, because these contradictions have already been pulled out. You've already got Tory MPs tweeting footage of him saying warm things about Jeremy Corbyn. You've got, in fact, the Jewish Leadership Council pointing out this hypocrisy and saying, well, how does Keir Starmer, kind of, kind of correlate these two positions, one where he stood in 2019 and two what he's saying today? They don't square up. And I think that is a problem for him. This thing of sort of saying one thing at one time because it's convenient and another at another, I think is going to be a running theme of attacks on him.
Do you think there's also an issue here of what does Keir Starmer stand for? Because obviously he stood on a very particular political platform when he was running for leader of the Labour Party, and now it seems he's sort of moved quite far away from that. So do you think that issue of trust is not just about what he thinks of Jeremy Corbyn, but actually his political positions at the heart of his agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's going to cost him, because I think the Tories are setting fire to themselves at a rate that is kind of almost unprecedented, really. And so he's almost certain to become the next Prime Minister. The problem with where he's positioning himself now, which is this kind of very kind of moderate New Labour light, really, kind of position, is that it won't achieve anything. And the real risk he runs is getting into power and disappointing people immensely very quickly, because he hasn't got the sort of scale of policy program that's going to solve the problems in the British economy. There's no point identifying what's wrong under the Tories and then saying, well, we're not going to do much about that. And that's the problem, I think, that Labour runs. One, it will disillusion people, and two, it just won't make things better. So, he runs the risk of being a very short-lived prime minister if he's not careful.
And how do you think that socialists who choose to stay in the party can really withstand the fact that Starmer is willing to use the party machinery to actually push them out of the party if they step over particular lines? What do you think is the strategy, given that he's willing to kind of be quite ruthless in that regard, perhaps even more ruthless than Tony Blair ever was?
Oh yeah, much more, much more. I mean, I think you have to go back at least to the days of Kinnock, to find a kind of level of purging of the left on this scale, and even then, I think this is probably in excess of that. So my advice to people would be, and this is something, I practice what I preach on this. I'm the chair of my local Labour Party. I think you have to build alliances. Build agreements with people where you can. Don't accentuate divides unnecessarily, but do fight for your beliefs. Do try and organise locally, both within and without the party. Make sure that your local party has connections to the trade unions locally as well as nationally, if you can, and try to, as I say, just try to organise as well as you can, because whether you're in the Labour Party or you're forced out of the Labour Party, as we've seen with some people, you want to be politically active, and therefore you have to try and find ways of building alliances. That's an important thing, I think, in politics anyway. So, clearly, if people end up getting expelled and kicked out of the party, they will have to find ways of working and building alliances around that. But there's no shortage of campaigns to support at this time. It's not like, we're in a political kind of, vacuum at the moment. There's a big uprising of industrial action on a scale not seen since the 1980s. At the moment, there's clearly community campaigns breaking out all over. There's lots of kind of mutual aid kind of activism to get involved in. I just say to people, look, don't get wedded to whether you're in the party or not. Fight for what you believe in, and as socialists, that's what we've got to do wherever we can.
And so, moving away from the future of Starmer necessarily, if Corbyn does choose to run as an independent in Islington North, do you think he can win?
I mean, generally speaking, and we've seen this from people on the left as well as people on the right. It's difficult, right? But I think Jeremy Corbyn, because he's been the MP there for 40 years, because he's been a very diligent constituency MP, and has a large following, has a national platform, because he was Labour leader, I think he probably would stand a very good chance. I don't know that he will seek to. I think he's still, as his statement yesterday and today has kind of intimated, he still wants to stand as the Labour candidate. I don't think he's given up hope of doing that. I think that looks like a very, uphill battle if we're being generous at this stage. But clearly, if he does, I think a lot of people will support him, and I think he'll probably stand a fairly good chance of being elected. In the same way that if you look at Ken Livingstone's run in 2000 for the London mayoralty, because he had that platform, because he'd kind of done the role before, he had that. And because of the injustice of the way he was blocked from standing, he had that momentum behind him, small m, to be able to stand and to win. And I think probably Jeremy is in a position where he could do that. The problem for the Labour left is if he does do that, I suspect a lot of people end up getting expelled because they'll back him, and that will then pose a question about what happens to the Labour left in those circumstances.